My name is Matilda, and I am 59 years old. For almost all my life, I have been a mother, wife, nurse, cook, and housekeeper. All in one. I never complained, not even when my hands bled from endlessly sewing other people's clothes to feed my family. I believed that loving with all my heart would be enough for my children to always respect me, but at this age, the only thing I have achieved is the title of a burden. I live with my son Esteban, his wife Carla, and my 2 grandchildren. They say they love me, but with each passing day, I doubt it more and more. They speak to me impatiently, correct me in everything, and if I sneeze louder than I should, they already look at me as an annoying nuisance. Carla doesn't allow me to cook because I, supposedly, make a mess, and to clean because I already see poorly. Esteban, my son, has turned into a person who barely looks me in the eye. They only tolerate me because I take care of the children. A few days ago, I came out of my room and overheard them talking in the living room. They didn't know I was there. Carla was saying that it was time to look for something for her, mother-in-law and Esteban. He kept saying that he couldn't bear such a responsibility anymore. They uttered the word nursing home as if it were a blessing in disguise. I felt paralyzed. My legs trembled, my heart clenched into a knot. I, who had given them all my youth, had now become old furniture that didn't fit the decor. I remained silent, swallowing my sobs as I had done so many times in my life. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my worn-out hands. At that moment, I realized that they no longer saw me as a mother or a person. I am simply a burden they are ashamed of. But they don't know that I can also make decisions. If they want to get rid of me, they will, but not in the way they think. That night, I didn't close my eyes. I went to bed early, pretending to have a headache, but in reality, my soul was shattered. I heard Carla's footsteps pacing back and forth. The sound of her heels echoed in my head, as if marking the rhythm of my sentence. Each sound was confirmation. They no longer wanted to see me. Not because I had done something wrong, but simply because of who I am. A memory flashed in my mind of little Esteban, who was often sick. I stayed up all night taking care of him, fever, vomiting, anything. He clung to my neck and whispered, "Mommy, don't go." And now he himself is looking for a way to gently usher me out of his house. The irony squeezed my chest like a vice. What did I do wrong in raising such a heartless person? Did I love him too much, or did I forget about myself? The next day, Carla left a folded brochure on the table. "Just take a look," she purred in a saccharine voice. It was an advertisement for a nursing home. Everything looked so clean, neat, with smiling people in fake photos. But it's not a place to live, but a place to disappear. I silently placed the brochure on the refrigerator. She was waiting for my reaction, but I was no longer going to give them the pleasure of seeing my tears. That same day, I decided that something had to change. I am not going to beg for. Love is not begged for, nor is respect. Perhaps I could not erase the years given without reservation, nor demand the return of lost time, but I could certainly reclaim what I had left, my dignity. Slowly, as if planning a quiet escape, I began to tidy up my belongings. Where I would go, I didn't yet know, but one thing was clear: I would not allow myself to be buried alive. All morning, I folded clothes, hid important documents, and sorted through photographs, trying to take with me at least a few memories. Carla watched me furtively, as if sensing something was amiss, but remained silent. Esteban, on the other hand, didn't care at all. I had probably become a piece of furniture to him long ago. I glided through the house like a shadow, trying not to make noise, not to disturb, but inside me, a real storm was brewing. In the afternoon, Esteban approached me while the children were playing in the yard. "Mom, you should think about the nursing home. Carla and I think it would be best for everyone," he said without a hint of shame, as if he were talking about an old sofa that. Pain constricted my chest like a vice. Something broke inside, but I didn't let him see it. I looked him straight in the eye and quietly asked, "Do you think so?" He just shrugged, indifferently and distantly. Arguing, shouting, all of that seemed pointless. At some point, my son stopped seeing me as a person. And the most painful thing was not his coldness, but the realization that my whole life, given to him, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, all of it was for nothing. I remained standing in the kitchen, watching the fading sun through the window. Loneliness enveloped me, suffocated me. Even the ringing laughter of my grandchildren brought no comfort. That night, when everyone was asleep, I took out my old, worn notebook. Among its pages lay the only letter I had received in many years, a message from Dona Beatriz. She had been my client for over 10 years, until her death. She said I was the only person who was there for her out of genuine affection, not for selfish reasons. And she left me something more than just words. She gave me the opportunity to start all over. Only I knew about it, and now it's. The secret was to be my salvation. Dona Beatriz was the only person outside my family who treated me with genuine tenderness. I sewed dresses for her, accompanied her to the doctor, made tea the way she liked it, with a slice of orange and honey. She never saw me as just a servant. She always said, "Matilda, you deserve a beautiful life, even if your loved ones can't give it to you." I just smiled in response, not knowing what to say to such kindness. When she died, her lawyer tracked me down. I thought he wanted to return things she had lent me, but instead, he handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter written in her own hand and documents for a savings account opened in my name. Beatriz had left a considerable sum in case you ever decide to live for yourself. I hid those papers like a treasure and told no one about them. Years passed, and I didn't touch a single peso. I always believed that someday my children would take care of me, and that money would be for emergencies, but now I understood that a crisis was brewing. Me, my soul, my pride, my desire to experience something new before I got too old. There was fear, yes, but a fire was already burning in my chest. I was no longer the submissive woman I used to be. Something had awakened in me. And so, that night, while Esteban snored on the couch and Carla, glued to her phone, sat in her room, I made up my mind. Tomorrow I'll leave. Without screams or reproaches. I'll leave quietly, as they wanted. But this time not to hide, but to start over. Because, even if they didn't believe it, there was still life in me. And I was going to live it without asking anyone's permission. I woke up before the sun. The silence in the house enveloped me in a mixture of calm and sadness. I dressed in simple clothes, took a bag, a small suitcase, and a notebook. No photos, no souvenirs, nothing that could emotionally tie me down. If I've learned anything in the last few days, it's that freedom can't be built by dragging chains behind you. I quietly closed the door of my room, as if saying goodbye to a part of myself. Before leaving, I lingered in the kitchen. Out of habit, I made coffee, although its taste meant nothing to me anymore. On the table, I left a letter written in a shaky but firm hand. No apologies, no explanations, just the words, "Thank you for the little you gave me. I'm leaving to live the rest of my days. Don't worry, I won't be a burden anymore." I signed my full name as if reclaiming a personality lost for many years. I took a taxi to the center. From the window, I watched the neighborhood fade behind me, and with each turn, I felt my breath returning. I arrived at the building where I had booked an apartment, furnished, small, but bright, paid for in advance with the funds left by Dona Beatriz. Opening the door, I took a deep breath. It didn't smell of family or the past here, it smelled of beginnings. That night I slept alone, but I didn't feel abandoned. For the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. For a long time, no one judged me, yelled at me, or made me feel worthless. I, a 59-year-old woman, was finally free, exhausted, wounded, but alive. And that was already a great victory for me. The first few days in my new apartment felt strange. I had time, silence, space, and I had no idea what to do with it. I was so used to running and serving others that solitude seemed like an unpardonable luxury. I caught myself asking permission to turn on the television or pouring myself a coffee with guilt. As if their voices still echoed within me, scolding me even from a distance. One day, I stopped in front of the mirror and looked at myself carefully. How many years had it been since I did that? The dark circles under my eyes were no longer from sleepless nights with the children, but from emotional exhaustion. My hands, once strong, now trembled when I held a cup. But behind it all, I saw something I hadn't noticed in a long time, the possibility of healing. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time I felt like I could. I decided to do something I had never done before, think about myself. I went to a coffee shop in the city center, ordered my favorite cake, and settled by the window. No one rushed me, no one asked questions. I felt that the world wouldn't collapse if I enjoyed 5 minutes without serving anyone. I opened my notebook and started writing down my feelings. It wasn't poetry or literature, it was just the truth, my truth. Today I didn't apologize for existing, I wrote. And that phrase became my promise. No more silence that kills, no more obligatory smiles. If my children turned away from me, it's their choice. But I still have time to embrace myself. Even if it's late, even if it hurts, I deserve it. I deserve to live again. For days passed before Esteban called me, but not to ask if I was okay, but to say that the food no longer tasted the same and that the children were asking about their grandmother. I listened to him in silence, not saying where I was. He didn't believe I was capable of really leaving. For him, I was just like an old piece of furniture, always in its place, always available. But even an old armchair sometimes disappears from the living room. And then, Carla sent an icy message disguised as feigned concern, "We just want to know that you're okay. The house is so empty without you." How strange, I thought. When I was around, they barely exchanged a few words with me. And now that I can no longer be a convenient object for them, they suddenly miss me. Not out of love, no, but out of habit. I disrupted their well-oiled routine, where I played the role of a quiet servant, and that is unforgivable for them. I didn't answer her or the other one. I wrote their words down in a notebook, not to remember them, but to keep from breaking down. Love that demands eternal sacrifice is not love, it is violence disguised as affection. That night, I cried. Not for them, but for myself. For all those times when I endured casual insults, neglect disguised as jokes, silence that weighed heavier than a scream. It was my farewell, and I mourned it quietly, in a low voice. But after the tears came peace. I made myself tea, lit a candle, and I took a deep breath. No one was waiting for me with a reproachful look, no one was looking at me as a burden. That moment of peace was more precious than all the years lived in agonizing for the sake of love. I didn't run away, I saved myself. A few days later, I visited Dona Beatrice's lawyer. I hadn't seen him in years, but he greeted me with a warm smile, as if welcoming someone who should never have left. I explained that I wanted to use part of the inheritance for a special purchase. This idea had been brewing in me for a long time, to get back what had been taken from me by deceit. He didn't go into details, just nodded understandingly. He knew that this decision was dictated by my very soul. With his help, I began the process of buying the house where Esteban lived with his family. No one knew that this property had been purchased with my savings, although it was registered in his name. Back then, I said it was a gift, but the truth is that it was wrenched from me, under the guise of guilt and blackmail. Now fate was giving me a chance. I was eager to correct this outrageous injustice and wasn't going to miss my chance. The matter moved surprisingly quickly. It turned out that Esteban, mired in debt, had mortgaged the house, risking losing it. All I had to do was show up with the necessary amount and sign my name. In less than a week, the house legally belonged to me. Leaving the notary's office, I felt no revenge, only the triumph of justice. Belated, but deserved. The strength of someone who is no longer afraid to lose, because they have already lost everything once. That night, I slept more peacefully than ever before. I didn't say a word to anyone, not out of fear, but wanting to enjoy this small victory in silence. I was no longer a mother frozen in anticipation. Now I am a woman, step by step, reclaiming what was once ruthlessly taken from her. And there was still much to be returned. On the third day after buying the house, Esteban called again. This time, there were different notes in his voice. Not irritation or worry, but a kind of anxiety. He asked if I had heard anything about the bank, that some people had come. I noticed how Carla was getting nervous about some strange papers. I pretended to know nothing. Papers? No, son, I have no idea what you're talking about, I said with a calmness that surprised even myself. It hurt me to feel his confusion, but the truth he revealed to me hurt much more. This call only confirmed my suspicions. They were beginning to feel the ground tremble beneath their feet. As I learned later, Carla had to cancel purchases because her bank card was blocked. Everything was starting to fall apart for them, and they didn't even understand where this tremor was coming from. Meanwhile, I continued to sit in my small apartment, sipping coffee by the window, as if nothing was happening. Watching their shaky world, without lifting a finger, was my poetic justice. At night, I wrote in my notebook, not planning revenge, but simply pouring out everything that I had swallowed in silence for years. I wrote down phrases like, "They took my place, but they didn't take my courage," or "Oblivion hurts more when it comes from the one you raised." Simple words, but so necessary. It was my therapy, my outlet, my way of not falling into the abyss of despair. The rage that would have once consumed me had subsided. I knew they would come soon, but this time not to ask for a favor, but to demand explanations. But I was no longer the same. They didn't know it yet, but the meek Matilda was a thing of the past. Now they were faced with a woman who was no longer afraid of loneliness. She had realized that being with someone who doesn't love you is a cruel form of isolation. As I suspected, they didn't keep me waiting long. One afternoon, while watering the plants on my balcony, I heard a persistent knock at the door. It was Esteban. Behind him stood Carla, arms crossed and with an unfriendly expression. My first impulse was not to open it, but something inside told me it was time to face them. I opened the door with an unruffled calm, like someone with nothing to hide. "Mom, we need to talk," he said as if he still had power over me. No greeting, no question about how I was feeling, he had only come for answers. Carla wasted no time starting her. "What have you done to the house? Where did these papers come from? What have you gotten yourself into?" Their words reached me like the sound of rain. I wasn't obligated to explain anything to them, but, gathering my courage, I said firmly, "I simply took back what always belonged to me." Their faces twisted in an instant. Esteban went numb, and Carla nearly screamed. They insisted I had no right, that it was a betrayal. How could I do this to them? I stared at them intently, not with anger, but with dignity. "The betrayal is what you did to me. Trying to put me away in a nursing home so you could live in the house I paid for. Isn't that despicable?" For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. They didn't know how to deal with a woman who would no longer be manipulated. I didn't argue. I asked them to leave, said that all matters would now be handled by lawyers, and that they shouldn't look for me because I wouldn't change my mind this time. Closing the door behind them was like finishing a whole chapter. It hurt, of course, but it hurt even more to pretend to be loved when I was simply being used. At 59, I finally realized that being good wasn't enough, and that I also had a right to justice for myself. After that visit, they no longer knocked on my door, but started writing, calling, leaving notes under the apartment door. Esteban, with the tone of a repentant son, insisted that it was all a misunderstanding, that they loved me very much, and that the house wasn't that important. Carla, on the other hand, changed tactics. Now she played the loving daughter, calling me mommy in her messages and saying that the children missed me. How easy it is to pretend to be loving when you're losing your privileges. I read each word with the same detached gaze with which one scans advertisements for trash on the street. It wasn't cruelty, it was self-care. It took me years to understand that not everything that seems like love is actually love. True love is unconditional. It doesn't only appear when you cut off the tap of benefit. They didn't love me, they needed me, and I was no longer willing to be useful. The shore of my soul. Meanwhile, my life, though quietly, began to bloom. I started attending a small art workshop near the park. At first, it was difficult for me to hold a brush without thinking about laundry or preparing meals, but with each stroke, I felt something within me being restored. There was room for myself in my life again. Sometimes I stopped and thought, so this is what it's like, to live for yourself. I no longer asked permission to exist or apologized for not responding. I also had the right to be unavailable, not to answer calls full of fake tears, to say no without feeling guilty. I gave everything I had, even more. Now I understood that I wasn't born to be a servant, but to be a woman, and I still had time to become one. One Sunday evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood where I used to live. Not to spy or out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. I was wondering what the place looked like without me. I walked slowly in dark glasses and, under the shadow of a hat that hid my face, I saw Esteban from a distance. He was standing at the entrance, arguing furiously on the phone. His brows were furrowed in a scowl, his shirt was crumpled, and there was nothing familiar left in his expression. Carla ran out after him, shouting something at his back, and the sound of children crying came from the house. I stopped on the opposite side of the street, hiding in the shadows, and watched. For years, I believed that they would be happier without me, that my presence was the cause of their discord. But now the truth was revealed to me in all its ugliness. Their unhappiness is not my fault. They nurtured it themselves with their ingratitude, their inability to love without demanding anything in return. They used me as an emotional shield, and when I disappeared, they were left defenseless. I saw Carla slam the door, leaving Esteban alone on the sidewalk. He sat down on a bench and covered his face with his hands. For a moment, a sharp pain pierced my chest, but it wasn't pity for him. It was pity for the Matilda I once was, the one who would have rushed to him with a blanket and a glass of milk. That Matilda no longer existed. Now I was a woman watching from the sidewalk. I kept walking. She didn't stop to comfort or demand explanations, she simply walked with her head held high while they grappled with the void they themselves had created by pushing her out. Because that's what the ungrateful do. They cry when the source dries up, but never remember how they scorned the water when it was there. That day, I finally understood, they didn't need a mother, but a maid with a heart, and I was no longer fit for that role. The following week, I enrolled in art history courses at the public library. It had always appealed to me, but I never had the time, or rather, I never allowed myself to have it. Guilt always took over. I thought dedicating myself to something that wasn't beneficial to others was a waste of time. But now, with each book I opened, I felt like I was reclaiming years of life that had been stolen from me in the name of duty. I would sit in the back row, taking notes like a diligent student, and I wandered among paintings and unfamiliar artists I hadn't known in my youth. I began to see beauty in the small things, in conversations with strangers, in a quiet cup of tea, in the sunset light playing on paper. No one told me this, but I felt it. I was healing, slowly but surely, like a flower pushing through the ruins. One day, after class, a gray-haired lady approached me and said, "You radiate a bright energy, as if you've escaped something dark." I smiled, not knowing what to say. I didn't tell her my story, I simply nodded, because yes, I had escaped them, from myself, from the false idea that a good mother is one who sacrifices herself to complete exhaustion. I used to be that woman. But not anymore. Now my days belong only to me. I don't get calls asking for favors. No one raises their voice at me for not opening the blinds properly. I'm not silenced with ridiculous excuses. No one demands, no one sets conditions. I have few possessions, but I have the most precious thing I lost for many years. Freedom. And although I've only come to it now, scarred but without a trace of shame, I can finally say it. It took me a full 59 years to finally find myself. One morning, while sorting through my things, I came across that very tattered notebook where I kept records of the inheritance Dona Beatriz had left me. There was enough money to live the rest of my days comfortably. I didn't need luxury or extravagance. All I craved was peace. And that's exactly what I bought with those savings. Peace. I thought about how much I could have done for my children if they had appreciated me even a little. But that didn't matter anymore. I decided to invest in myself for the first time in my life. I renovated my modest apartment, bought some paintings, new books, a comfortable armchair for reading in the evenings, and a coffee maker that made coffee exactly the way I like it, without having to make it for anyone else. It might seem like small things, but each detail was a statement. This is mine, and it's for me. Not to please others, not to be useful, but simply because I deserve it. My children knew nothing about this. The money. I never mentioned it because I didn't think it was necessary. If they had known before, they would have squeezed me dry, without a shred of conscience, as they did with my time, my body, and my patience. This fortune was my secret, my shield, my insurance against emotional manipulation. And now every penny had a single purpose, to give me back what years of neglect had taken from me. I wasn't rich, but I had peace, dignity, and a life where I didn't have to justify my existence. That was worth more than any inheritance handed out to ungrateful hands. Sometimes I wondered if they would ever realize what they had lost. Maybe yes, maybe no, but it was no longer my problem. Because there are things that money can't buy, and one of them is respect, which is lost forever. Several days passed without any news from them. Complete silence. No messages, no calls, no hints disguised as nostalgia. I imagined them licking their wounds or planning their next move, but I was no longer interested. I wasn't tormented by curiosity or plagued by a desire for reconciliation. You know, forgiving is one thing, but sticking your neck out again where they strangled you without remorse is quite another. I started introducing myself by my full name in every new place I went. I am Matilda. I'm 59 years old, and I'm here to learn, not to babysit anyone. At first, people looked surprised, but then they smiled with respect. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's mom, someone's mother-in-law, or that woman who helps around the house. I was just me, with my name, my story, my own voice. One day, the teacher in the art workshop asked us to create a work that reflected what we had overcome. I spent a long time wondering what to paint, until an idea came to me, the silhouette of a woman climbing out of a dark box, her back bent, but her eyes open. It was me, a mother they wanted to bury before my time, a woman who had served others so much that she had forgotten her right to live. When I hung the painting on the wall in the classroom, some of my classmates came up to me with tears in their eyes. I saw understanding in their eyes. They hugged me without asking for explanations. They knew what it was like too. No explanation was necessary. There is pain that is universal to women who have given everything. And who woke up one day. That day I realized I was no longer alone. No, I simply reclaimed my name. I found a place where no one demanded that I disappear. One Sunday morning, as I was about to go for a walk, the doorbell rang. It was the concierge, announcing that someone had come to see me. I asked who it was, and he, with that awkward tone that people have when they foresee drama, replied, "Her daughter, Señora Laura." It took me a few seconds to realize it. I hadn't heard from her in months, the very one who always apologized for being too busy. And now she suddenly appeared, as if nothing had happened. I went downstairs with a firm heart, not with hatred, but with armor. Laura was waiting for me with flowers in her hand and a strained smile. She said she had seen posts on social media about my paintings, that she wanted to visit me, that she missed me. All very nice, very soft, but... Until she suddenly let slip that Esteban had told her about the house. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay, Mom," she said, but there was something more in her eyes. I invited her in, made coffee, and we made small talk. She tried so hard to seem close, as if years of neglect could be erased with a couple of compliments. But I'm not so easily manipulated anymore. I asked directly why she hadn't called even once when I needed her most. And she had no answer. Her whole game collapsed in an instant. She mumbled that she didn't know, that she thought I was fine, that everyone has their own problems, old excuses in a new wrapper. Before leaving, she hugged me as if seeking forgiveness without uttering it. I didn't forgive her, but I didn't refuse forgiveness either. I just said, "I'm glad you're doing well, but I'm not the same as before. Now I take care of myself." I walked her to the door and, closing it behind her, took a deep breath. There are visits that hurt not by what they say, but by what they didn't say when you needed it most. And this, without a doubt, was one of them. 2 days after the visit. Esteban. He was the one downstairs. He didn't come up, didn't call, just stood by the entrance, waiting for me to come down. I saw him from the window. There wasn't a trace of his former defiant arrogance in his posture, not a hint of the haughtiness with which he insisted that a nursing home was a great option. Now his shoulders were slumped, as if the weight of the decisions he had made had finally crushed him to the ground. I didn't go down. I just watched from above as he paced back and forth with his phone in his hand. Nervous. Anxious. He sent a message, "Mom, I'll only be 5 minutes, just to talk." I read it, reread it, and left it unanswered. Not out of pride, out of caution. I knew that every word he said would be an attempt to break my will. And I wasn't going to back down anymore. After a few minutes, he left, taking with him that tiny piece of me that was still wavering. Because seeing him there, with his worn face and extinguished eyes, it got to me. But not enough to forget everything. It's not about revenge. It's about respect. The respect he denied me. Years had passed. Now he wanted to talk, but only because he could no longer maintain the comfortable life he had built on my back. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "It's not about whether I forgive him. It's about the fact that I'm not going to give up anymore, as if I'm surrendering." Forgiving doesn't mean going back. Forgiving also means firmly closing the door and continuing to walk. I was no longer his lifeline, and he needed to learn to swim without drowning me in the process. Sometimes, while sipping coffee on the balcony, I allow myself to think about the past, not with nostalgia, but with perspective. I remember how Esteban would fall asleep as a child, hugging me around the waist. How Laura would bring me drawings, saying that I was the best mom in the world. It wasn't always bad. There was love, there was laughter, there were real moments, but over time that love became convenient for them and a sacrifice for me. I regret it, yes, but not that I loved them. I regret that I believed that loving is the same as disappearing, that being a good mother means forgetting about yourself. Always last. How painful it was to realize this so late, when I had already been clearly told that I was only good if I was useful. But it would have been even more painful never to understand it. I know now, at the very least, that I deserve more than a cold dinner and a tiny room in the back of the house. One day, a neighbor invited me to a circle of older women who meet every week to talk, share their worries, and support each other. I went there not knowing what to expect, but I left with an enlightened soul. I heard stories so similar to my own that I felt a shiver run down my spine: invisible mothers, rejected grandmothers, women who had given everything and are now struggling to reclaim their place in this world. I am not alone, I never have been.